I'm wearing a number of different hats these days, and I wanted to say just a little bit about the last one, about the teaching part. Because I had a revelation a few years ago. This is after many, many years of giving literally thousands of presentations to students, to corporate executives, testifying before the U.S. Congress, and talking to audiences all over the world. And I finally had the realization that many of the ideas, many of the recommendations, many of the concepts that I was trying to convey weren't being fully comprehended by my audiences. And the reason for that was that I, as well as many other water professionals, I think we take too much for granted. We make an assumption that the general public knows more about water than actually some of the market research suggests. A few years ago, my organization, the Nature Conservancy, conducted a market research poll of Americans, and we were a bit dismayed to find out that 77% of Americans have absolutely no idea where their water comes from. They can't say more than it comes out of the tap or it comes out of the shower. They couldn't name the river, they couldn't name the underground aquifer, the lake that their water comes from. And so this revelation left a very big impression on me, and it made me understand that if I was going to continue to try to share what I know about water, that I was going to have to be a little bit more careful with some of the terminology and some of the assumptions about the level at which I'm talking to my audiences. Now, so if at times during this presentation you feel like I'm talking like a school teacher, that's the reason why, is that I'm just trying to make sure that everybody understands the concepts and where I'm coming from and the assumptions that I'm making. And so I'm going to build this understanding literally from the ground up. I'm going to start with the basic foundations of water. And today, of course, I'm going to be speaking specifically about the quantity of water that is available to us or not available to us, and some of the issues, challenges, and problems that that's creating in the world. So here's what we're going to cover today. I'm first going to try to answer the question of, are we running out of water? And then I will, spoiler alert here, I am going to conclude that yes, there are parts of the world that are running out of water. So I want to address, how did we get into this mess? Why are we running out of water? And then starting to switch to solutions, I want to say a little bit about why business as usual isn't going to work, at least not going to work as well in the 21st century as it did in the 20th century. And then I'm going to really hone in on a handful of strategies, a handful of solutions that are being demonstrated, put into place to very, very good effect, both in cities and farms around the world. And I'll conclude with some ideas about what our future might look like in a water-secure future. So the first question, are we running out of water? Well, this is one of the most common questions that I get asked in all of my presentations. And I get asked because many of us, nearly all of us, were taught in grade school that there is this global water cycle, that water is constantly moving through the atmosphere and raining down on the land, and that water's moving across the land and beneath the soil, underground, and there's this great circulation system that we call the global water cycle, powered, of course, by solar energy. And so the follow-up question that I typically get is, how could we be running out of water? Don't we have the same amount of water on our planet as we've always had? And the basic answer is yes, that's true. But in the global hydrologic cycle, the water evaporates off the ocean. A very, very large amount of fresh water is produced simply by that solar process, that solar energy. Condenses into clouds. The clouds are carried by wind over the landscape. It rains or snows on the land. And then it travels over the land. Some of it will travel through the ground and get into underground aquifers. Some of it will travel over the surface and gather into rivers, into lakes. Some of it gets stalled out for a little while. Some of it will get stuck in a lake for a little while, stored in a lake for a while. Some of it will end up in groundwater aquifers and basically get stuck there for a while. But what I'm really talking about here today is the water that's moving through that global water cycle. And so how is it exactly that we could be running out of water, given that we do have the same amount, the same volume, traveling through this global water cycle on our planet? This is a little bit of a different portrayal of the global water cycle. And don't worry about, there are some numbers on here. You don't need to pay any attention to those. Instead, the relative size of the bands of these big arrows is what I want you to pay attention to. And so this is a representation of what the global annual water cycle would look like if we human beings were not having any influence on it. And so of all that rainfall that comes down out of the sky, about close to 60%, close to 2/3 of it, hits the land surface and is immediately taken up by plants, taken up by vegetation, grasses, trees, wetlands, and that sort of thing. And then almost immediately after the plants use that water, it goes back up in the sky, it evaporates out of the plants, it transpires out of the plants, and goes back up in the atmosphere. And so it's kind of a short loop in the global water cycle that way. About 25% of the water that falls out of the sky ends up gathering and collecting in rivers, and some smaller portion of it then ends up percolating through the soil and getting into groundwater aquifers. That's the basic budget. That's the basic global water account represented here. Now I'm going to start to add in a little bit of the human influences, and we'll see how big of an effect they are having. This thin band is the portion of the rainfall that we essentially put to work in rain-fed agriculture. This is a portion of our crop production that uses purely rain. It's not irrigated with supplemental water. It's just grown on rain alone. This accounts for about 60% of all the crop production on the planet, and it's about 80% of the land that's being used for agricultural purposes. But as you can see by the width of this stripe, it's a pretty small number. So it's only about 5% of all that water that falls out of the sky is getting put to purpose in rain-fed agriculture. Now we can add on to that all of the other uses of water that we tap into for all of the human enterprise. We take water out of flowing rivers, we take water out of lakes, we take water out of the underground, out of groundwater aquifers, and we use it for all kinds of things. We use it in our cities, we use it in our industries, we use it to grow food when it requires supplemental irrigation. But again, you see the width of the band here. It's only adding another 4% of water use. So in total, only about 9% of the water falling out of the sky onto the land surface of our planet is being appropriated or utilized in some way for the human enterprise. Now, as you can see, all of that water that's put to use, whether it's flowing naturally and unobstructed in our rivers, or whether we're putting it to use for a while and then releasing it back into rivers or back into the sky, much of that water then flows out to our coastal areas, and about 1/3 of all that water then that comes out of the sky ends up flowing across the landscape and through the ground and ends up back into our oceans, and thereby completing that global water cycle. But again, you would say, 9%? Are you kidding me? How can we possibly have a water crisis? We're only appropriating 9% of all the available water. Things should be fine, right? And so this is the part that a lot of people don't understand about water scarcity and water shortages and how they emerge. Well, the explanation here is that although we aren't using much of the global water cycle, the problem is that we can't utilize all the water falling anywhere on the planet. And so in other words, if we're having a water shortage in the southwestern part of the United States, we can't readily, affordably tap into the Congo River over in Africa to supplement our water supplies. Okay? Technically, we could do it, yes. We could put it on tanker ships, we could run it across the land in rail cars, and we could get it to the southwestern United States. Technically, we can do it. Economically, it's impossible. It is not affordable to do that, given the expense that requires, and given the affordability, from our incomes and from the uses that we're putting the water to. So instead, we're relying upon our local water sources. We're relying upon the water that we can get to physically, technically, and affordably. So what that means is when the water comes out of the sky and it gathers in these local areas that we call watersheds, water running off the landscape, any of the water that runs off the landscape and ends up in the same place, the same river, is that river's watershed. And the same thing could be said for lakes. Lakes have watersheds. Even groundwater aquifers could be thought of as having a watershed. We refer to it as a recharge area, but it's basically the same concept. So the water falling out of the sky gathers into these local areas, into these local rivers, into these local lakes, and those become our water sources. Those become our water accounts. Those become the buckets of water that we tap into for our water supplies. Here's a picture of a groundwater aquifer, same basic concepts. The water falls out of the sky, it hits the land surface, some of that percolates or infiltrates into the soil, and some of it goes down deep enough and gets into the underground areas and gathers in a big underground reservoir pool that we call an aquifer. Okay? So those are our three primary types of water sources: rivers, lakes, and aquifers. Those are the things that we rely upon for so much of the water that we utilize in our daily lives. I'm going to walk you through one more cartoon, if you will, because there's a couple of concepts embedded in here that will help you to understand why we run short of water, why we're depleting our rivers, why we're depleting our aquifers, and I do that pictorially here. This you could think of as the water budget for any one of those water sources, for a local river, a local groundwater aquifer. So all of the natural replenishment of any water source on the planet, any freshwater source on the planet, comes out of the sky as rain or snow. That's the entirety of our natural water supply. Once it gets into a local water source, then we extract it. A term of art in the water community is a withdrawal. We withdraw the water out of that water source. Then, of course, we put it to some sort of use. But then much of that water that we've used ends up being returned back to the original source after we've used it. I think the easiest way to think about this, at least for me, is to think about when I take a shower. I might be using 20 gallons of water. Actually, I don't, but on average, we use about 20 gallons of water in a shower. Almost all of that water, where does it go? It goes back into the drain. It goes back down into the drain, and then in most parts of the world, it ends up going to a treatment plant, an industrial-like plant that cleans the water again after we've used it, but then releases that water back into the original place that it came from. And so we're basically a big, giant water circulation machine, at least for much of our uses. In cities, on average, about 95 to 98% of the water that we use in our homes or inside our businesses gets recirculated in this way. It does not deplete the local water budget because it gets redeposited in the water account. It gets returned to the river, gets returned to the lake in some cases. That's not true in all places, but for the most part, this concept of the returned water or return flow is very important to understanding the water budget or the water account and understanding how you can dry up a river. The part that doesn't get returned back to the original source we refer to as a consumptive loss or depletion of the water source. So let's go back to the shower. When I take a shower, some portion of it is evaporating as steam, particularly if it's a particularly hot shower. Some of it ends up on my towel after I've dried off. But again, the vast majority went down the drain, gets returned to the original source. But some portion of it is lost, and we call that consumption. We've consumed the water. It's no longer available in the local water account. As far as our local water accounting to that river that we took the water from, it's gone now, okay? And that river is waiting for the next clouds to come by and the next rainfall to replenish that water that's lost.